Tonight, a man who once led men into gunfire was about to walk away from a restaurant kitchen, and no one in that room had any idea. For 2 years, he had scrubbed floors and swallowed insults, telling himself it was worth it for his daughter, for a normal life.
But before he could take one step toward the door, it opened, and the life he thought he'd buried came walking back inside.
She had spent 3 years searching for the man who once carried her daughter through fire, and now, by pure chance,
The rain had not stopped for 3 days, and Jake Harrison had decided that tonight of all nights would be his last shift at the Wilbury Grill. If you have ever felt invisible in a room full of people who should have seen your worth, stay with this story until the end, because what happens next will remind you why we never truly know who is standing in front of us. And if stories like this move you, hit like and subscribe, because there is so much more heart waiting for you on this channel. Jake had not always folded napkins for a living. 6 years ago, he had been Chief Petty Officer Jake Harrison, a decorated Navy SEAL who had led 31 combat missions without losing a single man under his direct command. He had jumped out of helicopters into hostile territory, carried wounded soldiers across open fields under fire, and once spent 4 days in a collapsed tunnel system extracting hostages without a single complaint. But none of that mattered anymore, not really. Not in the eyes of Marcus Delroy, the restaurant's general manager, who treated Jake like a disposable pair of hands. Rather than a man who had once held the lives of an entire platoon in his grip, it had not been an easy decision to leave the Navy. Jake's wife, Sarah, had passed away from an aggressive illness only 8 months after he came home from his final deployment, leaving him with a 6-year-old daughter named Lily and a grief so heavy it nearly swallowed him whole. He had made a promise to Sarah in her final days that he would be there for Lily every single day, that he would trade the uncertainty of deployments for the certainty of bedtime stories and school pickups. So Jake had walked away from the only career he had ever known, taken every odd job he could find, and eventually landed at the Wilbury Grill, a modest but well-regarded restaurant on the edge of a small coastal town, washing dishes, bussing tables, and occasionally filling in as a line cook when someone called out sick. For 2 years, Jake showed up early, stayed late, and never once complained, even as Marcus mocked his quiet demeanor, mispronounced his name on purpose, and assigned him the worst shifts without explanation. The other staff members largely ignored him, assuming the scarred, silent man in the back was simply a drifter with nowhere else to go. They had no idea that the same hands scrubbing pots at midnight had once disarmed explosives in the dark, or that the same eyes that avoided conversation had once studied satellite maps to save hostages half a world away. Jake preferred it that way. He had learned that trying to explain his past only invited disbelief or, worse, pity, and he had no patience for either. Tonight, however, something inside him had finally cracked. Marcus had accused him, in front of the entire kitchen staff, of stealing tips from the jar, a claim that was not only false but deeply insulting to a man who had once turned down a reward for saving a foreign dignitary's family because he believed the mission itself was payment enough. Jake had said nothing in his own defense because he had learned long ago that some battles were not worth fighting with words. Instead, he had quietly written a resignation letter during his break, folded it neatly, and slid it into his apron pocket, promising himself that after tonight he would find something, anything, that did not require him to shrink himself just to survive. As closing time approached, Jake began stacking chairs onto the empty tables, his mind drifting to Lily, who was at home with her elderly neighbor, probably already asleep with her stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. He thought about how he would explain the job loss to her, how he would need to find new work quickly, how the weight of being both mother and father sometimes felt like carrying a wounded soldier for miles with no end in sight. He was so lost in thought that he barely noticed the restaurant door swinging open against the wind and rain outside. A gust of cold air rushed through the dining room, scattering a few napkins from a nearby table. Jake looked up out of habit, the same instinctive awareness that had once kept him alive in hostile territory, and his eyes landed on a small girl's hand gripping tightly to the sleeve of a woman's coat. The girl looked to be around 8 years old, with curly dark hair and a yellow sundress that seemed slightly out of place against the cold, rainy night, clutching a worn gray stuffed rabbit against her chest. Behind her stepped a woman in an impeccably tailored ivory suit, her blonde hair pulled into a low, elegant bun, diamond studs catching the restaurant's warm light. Jake did not recognize her at first, not entirely. Not until she stopped walking altogether and simply stared at him from across the room, her composed expression slowly dissolving into something raw and disbelieving. It was the eyes that gave it away, sharp, intelligent, and impossibly familiar. The same eyes that had once looked up at him from beneath a pile of rubble, terrified and searching for any sign of hope. 3 years earlier, during what was supposed to be Jake's final classified operation before his discharge, his team had been called in to assist with the rescue of a kidnapped family during an overseas humanitarian crisis. The situation had deteriorated rapidly, and Jake had ended up separated from his unit, alone in a collapsing structure with a badly injured mother and her 5-year-old daughter trapped beneath debris. He had spent nearly 6 hours working in near total darkness, using nothing but a small flashlight and his bare hands to free them both before the entire building gave way. He had carried the mother out first, then gone back in alone against direct orders to retrieve the little girl, who had been too frightened to move on her own. He never learned their names. Command had classified the operation. The family had been quickly and quietly relocated for their safety, and Jake had simply moved on to the next mission, the next crisis, the next life that needed saving. He had no idea, until this very moment, standing in a rain-soaked restaurant with a stack of chairs in his hands, that the terrified 5-year-old girl he had pulled from that collapsed building had grown into the confident 8-year-old now standing 12 feet away from him, or that her mother, Elena Cross, had spent every year since desperately trying to locate the anonymous soldier who had saved both of their lives and then vanished without a trace. "It's you," Elena finally said, her voice trembling as she took a hesitant step forward, one hand rising to cover her mouth. "I don't believe it. It's actually you." Jake set down the chair slowly, his instincts telling him something significant was happening even before his mind caught up with the details. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Do we know each other?" he asked carefully, though something deep in his chest was already stirring with recognition he could not quite place. Elena's eyes filled with tears as she guided her daughter gently forward. "Mia, sweetheart, this is the man I told you about. This is the soldier who saved us." Mia looked up at Jake with wide, curious eyes, still clutching her stuffed rabbit, and Jake felt something shift inside him, a memory resurfacing from beneath years of controlled distance, a dark tunnel, a trembling child, a whispered promise that everything was going to be okay. Elena Cross was not simply a grateful stranger. She was the founder and CEO of Cross Humanitarian Group, a global organization that had grown into one of the largest privately funded disaster relief networks in the world, and she was, by most financial measures, a billionaire many times over. But in that moment, none of her wealth or status mattered to her nearly as much as finally standing face to face with the man who had spent hours in darkness refusing to leave her daughter behind. Word spread through the restaurant within minutes. Marcus, the same manager who had humiliated Jake only hours earlier, emerged from his office when he heard unfamiliar commotion, only to freeze mid-step at the sight of Elena Cross, whose face he instantly recognized from business magazines and news broadcasts, standing in his restaurant embracing his dishwasher like a long-lost family member. The other staff members gathered nearby, whispering among themselves, utterly bewildered by what they were witnessing. Elena turned to Marcus with a composed but unmistakably sharp edge in her voice. "This man saved my daughter's life. He spent 6 hours in a collapsing building, alone, with no guarantee he would make it out himself, and he never once asked for recognition or reward." She paused, letting her words settle over the room. "I have spent 3 years and considerable resources trying to find him, and tonight I discover he has been working here, in this restaurant, being treated, from what I have just overheard from your staff, with disrespect and suspicion." Marcus stammered an apology, suddenly aware of how precarious his position had become. But Elena was not interested in apologies directed at her. She turned instead toward Jake, her expression softening. "I don't know what circumstances brought you here, Jake, but I know you did not do this to yourself. Let me help you the way you once helped us, without hesitation and without needing anything in return." Jake, never a man comfortable with attention or gratitude, tried to deflect, insisting that he had only done what any soldier would have done, that Elena and Mia owed him nothing. But Elena refused to accept that answer. Over the following weeks, she quietly investigated the Wilbury Grill's business practices, uncovering that Marcus had been falsifying tip distributions among staff, skimming money meant for employees like Jake for over a year, and using intimidation to keep workers from reporting him. Elena, through her legal team, ensured the matter was properly investigated and that every employee who had been cheated was fully compensated, with Marcus ultimately removed from his position entirely. But Elena's gratitude did not stop at correcting a wrong. She offered Jake a position within Cross Humanitarian Group, leading a new division focused on emergency response training and disaster rescue operations, work that would allow him to use his skills to save lives without requiring him to return to a combat zone or leave his daughter behind for months at a time. It was in every sense the kind of opportunity Jake had never imagined possible: meaningful work, fair pay, and most importantly, a schedule built around being present for Lily. Jake accepted, cautiously at first, still unaccustomed to a world where his sacrifices were recognized rather than dismissed. Over the following months, he built a training program that would go on to save countless lives in disaster zones around the world, mentoring young rescue workers with the same quiet patience and unshakable calm that had once made him one of the most respected operators in his old unit. Lily, for her part, grew close to Mia, the two girls forming an unlikely friendship that neither of their parents could have predicted on that rainy night in a Smokstal restaurant. Years later, Jake would sometimes think back to that resignation letter, still folded away in a drawer at home, a quiet reminder of how close he had come to simply disappearing into another forgettable job, his true worth unseen and unspoken. He never regretted the years he spent scrubbing dishes and biting his tongue, because he understood something many people spend a lifetime learning too late: that dignity is not measured by the job title on your name tag, but by the quiet strength it takes to keep showing up, keep providing, and keep loving your child unconditionally, even when the world outside refuses to see your worth. Sometimes all it takes is one open door, one familiar face, and one moment of recognition to remind a person that their sacrifices were never invisible after all, only waiting for the right eyes to finally see them.